It's all here. All the minor nations, the Muslim nations, are coming into it.
To understand Revelation chapter 9, there is some historical background information we need to cover first, and we need to examine some glossary terms. There are 21 verses in this chapter which cover 2 prophecies. Those prophecies are astronomically dated historically, to the Middle Ages. And the descriptions of those armies are given by John, with some amazing detail. But John expresses those details in descriptions which make use of symbolism, idiomatic expressions and visual metaphors, to describe what he is seeing. And all of this language is historically contexted, within the culture and language, that John is writing in. Without any reference to that information, you will end up not having a clue what John is actually talking about, which is precisely where Counter-Reformation ministers end up taking their audiences. So here is a list of terms and phrases we will examine historically, before we begin. First, in verse 1, in the English translation, we read the term bottomless pit. If you don't know what a bottomless pit is, how would you ever know if anyone was ever given a key from it? So we need to examine this term. Counter-Reformationists claim this is a real pit that goes into the center of the earth, and has no bottom. Apparently never realizing or caring that their claim is not only based totally on ignorance about the world, geology and physics, but it is also just a lame cover story, to hide the actual contents of the text. If you look up the term abyss in a biblical dictionary, encyclopedia or lexicon, the explanations will bounce all over the place about it. Sometimes the explanations will literally contradict themselves in the very same article attempting to explain it. This legion of demons are begging Christ not to be sent back, and here comes that term, to the abuso. They came from the abuso, and they do not want to be sent back to the abuso. That is the term used in that text in Luke, written to Romans. Abuso. And not accidentally, that is the very same term, also used in Revelation chapter 9 verse 1. The reason you find this term in both of these places, is because they were referring to the very same thing. The only place that term is used outside of the book of Revelation in the entire New Testament, is used only when it is addressing a Roman audience in the city of Rome. That is the only place you will find that term used. The ancient Romans thought of a person in the afterlife as traveling on underground rivers, and the physical place they were buried in, the catacombs, would fill up with water during storms, because originally, the catacombs were the underground drainage system for the city of Rome. And these differences in Roman burial practices in the water drainage system, in Roman conceptions of the afterlife traveling on underground rivers, and in the actual watery burial environment itself, uniquely in the city of Rome, is reflected in the New Testament's use of the term abuso, when addressing a Roman audience about the dead. What we find in both uses in the Gospel of Luke and in the Epistle to the Romans, is clearly a reference, not to a pit without a bottom, but to the very well-known area which was a watery subterranean place of the dead, in the city of Rome. You've seen in the previous video that the bottomless pit is neither bottomless, nor even a pit, but instead is a substitute term used by counter-reformationists to cloak the use of the term abyss. A very particular reference to the Romans' conceptualization of the place of the dead, and used in historical context by Paul to refer to the catacombs, in the city of Rome. And you saw how it was used nowhere else in the entire New Testament, outside the book of Revelation, except with this one particular audience, and in this one particular sense. And you saw how therefore, when we read its use in Revelation chapter 9 verse 1, if we want to be honest, we know that this is the only other reference in the entire New Testament, with which to interpret its meaning. And that usage, is a completely unique non-Jewish usage, which is found completely outside the use of the same Greek term in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, where the term abyss, was not associated with the dead, but with bodies and sources of water. That now becomes very significant in the next topical glossary examination. Because now we are going to examine the Counter-Reformation's alleged locust-scorpion men, which are also described as real literal locusts, which come out of this non-existent bottomless pit. Obviously, if you have no bottomless pit, then nothing is ever going to come out of a bottomless pit, including zombie-producing locust scorpion men. And obviously, if the reference in Revelation chapter 9 verse 1 is in fact making a reference to the Roman place of the dead, known in Rome as the catacombs, then that clarifies the intended location of this text, and indirectly its time frame as well, quite dramatically. And it places these texts completely outside the realm of the Counter-Reformation's cartoonish fantasies about the end of the world and their imaginary monsters. Instead of being some ambiguous reference to some unknown weird interdimensional cosmic event in a bottomless hole in the earth, at the end of the world, it becomes quite focused on real events in history, in a very well-known historical area, with very well-known historic references to some very real historic things. And one of those things, which goes through this transformation from irrational fantasies into something very literal and real, is the subsequent reference to locust scorpion men and the words used by John to describe their emergence in history. If you listen to counter-reformationists explain the use of these terms, they will swear they have no idea what this means, other than an incredible reference to some fantastical unknown, zombie-producing, hybrid, bug-human creature from the future, which emerged from this amazing bottomless pit in the earth, which goes so deep, it actually reaches all the way to hell and back. It is a plot which might make for some good Saturday night science fiction entertainment, but unfortunately, the claim is very bad biblical hermeneutics. The text in Revelation make no such claims, and in reality, contains no real references to such things. John clarifies his own use of symbols within the very same chapter where they are used, so you literally only have to read a couple verses down in the text to see what he is actually referring to. In this video, you are going to see that there are no literal locusts nor scorpions being referred to in these texts, and what is being referred to by these terms and symbolic descriptions are being intentionally hidden from the public, once again, by those very explanations. And it is no accident that even the most ludicrous and insane explanations are much preferred by counter-Reformation religious leaders than the simple truth of the text itself in historical context. Because the truth of the text in historical context is much scarier to the religious establishment than even demonic locust scorpion bugs from an imaginary bottomless pit. It is actually much scarier to them than even that. And in a few minutes, you will see why. In the King James Version, we read in verses 1 through 3 the following, quote, "And the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth, and to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. And he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit, as the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and unto them was given power as the scorpions of the earth have power." End quote. So far in our study, we have noted the following translation oddities. The English word earth is used, instead of its real meaning in English, which is only the word, land or soil. We noted that the term, bottomless, has no reference to anything bottomless, but instead is a reference to subterranean water, and the term, pit, is really the word, well. And oddly enough, few of these things are reflected in most of our church board English translations. Despite the fact, these things are clearly the language of the actual text. That should be enough to raise a great deal of suspicion among seasoned Bible study students of any kind. We will encounter the same story when it comes to the identity of scorpions and locusts in verses 2 and 3. It is more than obviously clear to any honest-thinking person, John is not making any reference to either literal locusts or literal scorpions or any literal hybrid bug of the two. But when it comes to counter-Reformation theology, the two qualities of honest and thinking usually do not end up together.
These locusts are gonna be banging at your windows, and it's all you can do to keep them out. They're gonna be coming out of your faucet. Locusts, who can sting like a scorpion. They'll say, well, we've never seen anything like this. That's just the point. It's like War of the Worlds. Are gonna torment people for 5 months.
This smoke is made of locusts. Friends, these are not ordinary locusts.
These locusts come from the submerged chaos, which is an area underground. They're released by a spiritual being.
Now this right here is this winged creature. So we have the first of the 3 woes, the demon locusts. These locusts are described as locusts. I think they're demon hordes out of the pit, the bottomless pit. And
And they are as described. Now, they found 2 of them. And if you look, this thing actually has a stinger. They're obviously being locusts.
All this is a part of the plan of God. All this demonic plague that's coming on the earth is God's plan.
I'm gonna send a demonic army of locusts that sting like scorpions. And they're gonna torment you for 5 months.
Here is how you can know for a fact, John is not describing any literal locusts, or literal scorpions, or any kind of literal combination of the two. 1. John's language is language that is used to describe his vision. It is not language that simply describes a literal narrative of history. He is not telling his audience that he is watching CNN in the future, and is describing what is happening. He is telling his audience he is having a series of visions about the future, and here are the visions he saw. He uses the phrase, "I saw," in verse 1 at the beginning of the first prophecy about the first army, and again in verse 17 in his description of the second army. In both cases, he is explaining what he saw, the same way he saw it. In other words, he is describing the actual content of his vision, symbols and all. That point might seem trivial to some. But as far as the language itself goes, it is very important. Because if you insist an obvious symbol be taken only in a hyperliteralistic sense because that is what the language describes, rather than what is meant, then you are ignoring the fact he is describing in his language what he saw in his vision, not what literally occurs. His language describes what he sees in his vision. When John describes in the language, seeing locusts coming out of the smoke from the abyss, he is describing what he is seeing, not the actual prophecy itself. This is done throughout the book of Revelation, and he usually explains the difference in his texts by making a literal reference after his symbolism, and he does that in chapter 9 as well, later in verse 7. And that is why you know his references to locusts and scorpions are symbolic descriptions of an army. Visions occur the same way dreams occur, except you are awake when you have a vision, and you are asleep when you have a dream. But both kinds of information are internal, you see them in your imagination, and they consist of both literal and symbolic references. If you remember from the story of Joseph, the work of interpreting dreams and visions is made up of accurately distinguishing which is which, and finding the definition of the symbol. The same thing is true about visions. John's language is describing the symbolism, as it occurs, which is present in his vision. He does this throughout the book. And it is never a point of confusion, until someone simply wants it to be. When John describes a woman sitting on 7 mountains, no one pretends they do not know if it is literally a giant woman, or symbolic of a city. Because he points out what he means in chapter 17, just like he points out what he means by that language, in chapter 9. 2. Secondly, to further illustrate the fact John is not speaking literally about locusts and scorpions, John describes them emerging from a natural environment that would be an antithesis to real locusts. This antithesis is part of the prophetic message concerning his vision in verses 1 through 12. John is actually describing a set of opposites. Locusts do not live in smoke and fire. They are insects that require oxygen, just like virtually all life forms on planet Earth. Nor do locusts tolerate high temperatures. In fact, the only way in the ancient world to kill off a locust infestation was to actually kill them with smoke and fire, by burning the crop field they had infested. Because smoke and fire were lethal to real locusts. The second thing they did to fight locust swarms was to dig ravines or ditches and push them into the hole, and from there set them on fire. So the very two methods of fighting a locust infestation is actually mentioned as symbolically the source of the swarm of locusts that John sees in his vision. These two techniques of controlling a locust infestation were the equivalent of ancient pest control. So in the first statement we have 2 literal physical conditions described, that if taken literally, were actually used in the ancient world to exterminate locusts. And ironically, that is part of the message of this text that goes completely unnoticed by Counter-Reformation audiences. Smoke and fire were used to kill locusts in the ancient world, but here, the very thing that is supposed to be killing off locusts is somehow creating them. If John were describing literal locusts, he would not have suggested they come out of the fire and smoke, which was the normal method used to exterminate them. That is an important message about what is about to emerge in history. It is a picture of logical opposites. It would be the equivalent of saying today, You saw in a vision, an orc and pest control man, spraying pesticide to kill roaches, and all of a sudden, out of his spray can, came a stream of roaches. That would not be literal. But it would describe a nightmare scenario. And that is precisely what John is describing in Revelation chapter 9 verse 1. This image ties in with the subject matter of verse 1, which you will see more fully when we go through chapter 9 and exegete this chapter verse by verse. Verse 1 echoes an Old Testament text from Isaiah which describes the fall of Lucifer from heaven, and is intended by John to note the coming of the Antichrist in the first verse of this chapter. What follows in verses 2 through 12 are a description of the army of the Antichrist, and what brings their demise and destruction in history. So the use of these images of opposites and contradiction involving locusts illustrate the nature of unexpected opposites involving the ascent of the Antichrist to power. Just as you would not expect an orc and pest control man to be spraying roaches from a can of pesticide, so too, you would not expect someone who comes as an angel of light as the Antichrist does in verse 1, to actually be the source of all the darkness. That image is illustrated in John's symbolism, describing locusts coming out of smoke and fire, which is the very thing the ancients used to eliminate them. 3. John intentionally gives uniquely human attributes to what he is describing, first employing the symbolism of locusts and then also using metaphors associated with scorpions. John states explicitly in verse 11, that these locusts have the Greco-Roman deity Apollyon as their king. John knew when he wrote that statement, that in Proverbs chapter 30 verse 27, the scriptures say, quote, "The locusts have no king, yet go they forth all of them by bands." End quote. So John is intentionally attributing characteristics that are uniquely human traits to his description of these symbolic locusts. And they are intentionally traits that locusts are known not to have. But John's reference to Apollyon is not simply that he is not speaking of literal locusts. He mentions that Greco-Roman deity specifically because he is identifying the specific person who will be in charge of this army in history. And he notes the identifier, Apollyon, associated with their king. This will prove to be very significant when we go through the timeline of these texts, and you will see how amazingly accurate this prophecy actually was in history. 4. John further clarifies his intended reference to be symbolical by giving a long list of attributes of human qualities to his symbol of locusts, which literal locusts would be completely incapable of. In fact, in the text, he intentionally describes 10 uniquely human traits. 1. In verse 8, they have human hair. 2. In verse 11, they have a king. 3. In verse 4, they take human military orders. 4. In verse 9, they wage human war. 5. In verse 7, they conduct human military actions. 6. In verse 4, they also have an imposed, decision-based, human military discipline. 7. And also in verse 4, they are given human military commands. 8. In verse 9, they ride as human cavalry. 9. And in verse 9, they also prepare for battle with other humans. And last but not least, 10. In verse 7, they have human faces. That last point, that they have the faces of men, is John coming out and stating verbatim that he is describing men. Not just locusts or scorpions, but that these are men. Therefore, unless you just wish to simply ignore the details of the text itself, which many counter-reformationists actually do, these references are intended to be understood as symbolism for a human military. Not just any military, but the military that will emerge under the authority of the Antichrist, which comes in verse 1, as Lucifer described in Isaiah. And that text in Isaiah was written about the king of Babylon. And that is precisely the same kind of person John is describing in verse 1. In fact, later in the book, he will explicitly state this parallel with Babylon, in chapter 17. So this is not simply guessing or interpretive creativity. This is factually built into John's theme within the whole book of Revelation, and as you saw earlier, John's citation of Old Testament texts, comparing Rome to Babylon, begin as early as the first seal judgment in the earliest parts of the book of Revelation. And they continue to be repeated throughout the entire book, just as we see again in chapter 9 verse 1. Why did John use the symbol of locusts? The question arises, why does John invoke the symbolism of locusts to describe the army that emerges under the authority of the Antichrist? There are 3 reasons John invokes the symbolism of locusts in this text. The first reason is how the term is used in the Old Testament, which he is referencing. The second is that is precisely how this very army would actually be described in the future when it actually emerged. Locusts are known for their complete crop devastation, leaving nothing at all behind them. And that is how the actions of this army were described when they emerged. The army that John is prophesying was actually compared to crop harvesters in the way they indiscriminately mowed people down. Not by its enemies, but by its very own supporters. And it was not called that by way of a compliment. It was intended as an insult. John identifies the symbol of the locust to describe the actions of this army, and uses it in his prophecy to make the identification of this army unmistakable to his readers in the future. And the third reason that John used the term locusts, and possibly the most obvious reason of all, is that that was an extremely accurate visual metaphor for what they actually really looked like. And that appearance difference was a striking change in the physical appearance of the Roman army, which uniquely marked an exact and precise period of Roman history. First, let's look at what John was referencing from the Old Testament. Locusts were used in the Old Testament as symbolism for imperial militaries as well. John wasn't the first to do that. In fact, he was actually making reference to a famous prophecy called the Locust Prophecy. What was the Locust Prophecy? If you do an electronic search on the use of the term locusts, plural from the Old Testament, you will discover the term is used in 12 verses. Locusts are mentioned in the plagues of Egypt 5 times. Locusts are also mentioned as a punishment 3 times, twice in Chronicles and once in Psalms. Locusts are referenced once, and said to have no king in Proverbs. But the last 3 times the term locusts are mentioned in the Old Testament, the reference to them is completely symbolical in prophecies. And the only time they are referred to symbolically are in the use of prophecies. So if John is prophesying something in this text, it would be quite natural for him to remember the symbol of locusts used in prophecy. But when we look at what prophetic texts the symbol of locusts are actually used in, something even more amazing begins to emerge. The 3 times the symbol of locusts were used in prophecy in the Old Testament, they were all used to address one exact empire. All 3 uses address the same empire. You remember from earlier that the seal judgments targeted the western half of the Roman Empire in Campania and the city of Rome, and then the trumpet judgments targeted the eastern half of the Roman Empire, headquartered out of Antioch, Syria. We are still in the trumpet judgments, and all these judgments have to do with the destruction of the city of Antioch. Antioch was located in a region in the Middle East that had been formerly a core part of the Assyrian Empire. The locust prophecy found in 2 different books, in Isaiah and in Nahum, both prophesy the coming doom of the Assyrian Empire and its army. Despite the fact they were as numerous as locusts. The locust symbol is used 3 times, in Isaiah chapter 33 verse 4, in Nahum 3 verse 15, and Nahum 3 verse 17. Nahum chapter 3 verse 17 reads as follows, quote, "Thy crown are as the locust, and thy captains as the great grasshoppers, which camp in the hedges in the cold day, but when the sun arises they flee away, and their place is not known where they are." End quote. So John's use of the locust symbolism, from the locust prophecy, concerning the Assyrian Empire, was a reminder to his readers, that this vast army which would arise under the authority of the Antichrist in verse 1, would be like the army of Assyria, who was also as vast as locusts, but were destined to be defeated, and become non-existent in the future. And all these events, including the rise of the Antichrist in verse 1 and his army in verse 2, would spell doom for the city of Antioch, which the trumpet judgments were targeting the future of, beginning back in chapter 7 and 8. The second reason the symbol of locust was prophetically accurate and appropriate to use by John, is because that was how this army, in one of its first military genocides, was described by one of its very own sources. That is how Roman historians describe the actions of this army. Locusts are known for their crop devastation, leaving nothing behind them, in their wake of complete destruction. Roman church historian Theodoretus wrote in his Ecclesiastical History, chapter 5 section 17, concerning the massacre of Thessalonica, quote, The anger of the emperor rose to the highest pitch, and he gratified his vindictive desire for vengeance by unsheathing the sword most unjustly and tyrannically against all, slaying the innocent and guilty alike. It is said 7,000 perished without any forms of law, and without even having judicial sentence passed upon them. But that, like ears of wheat in the time of harvest, they were alike cut down. End quote. And the third reason, and probably the most obvious of all, was that this was a very accurate visual metaphor for how this army really actually looked. Prophecy is about pattern recognition. A pattern is described prophetically with enough detail in it to recognize that it has occurred when it happens. If a writer is too general, the prophecy could mean anything. By adding pattern detail to the prophecy, the writer is able to zero in on precisely what he is attempting to identify. One of the pattern details John adds in verse 7, to describe this army, is that they visually look like locusts. That is why in this vision, he describes seeing them as locusts. Because that is what they actually looked like. The period of history John is prophesying is future to his own day. In John's day, the Roman cavalry looked like this. But the period of history John is now describing is future to John's day, and he notes in his prophecy in chapter 9 several key developments in military weaponry, procedural policy and armament, that make his references to this army unmistakable. One of the reasons this army visually looked like locusts is because of the coming development in cavalry armament that John notes in his text. He mentions they have breastplates of iron. And the locusts look like horses prepared for battle with the faces of men. During this very period of history, you saw John targeted with his astronomical dating, was a new practice, called barding. It was not only covering the soldiers in plate armor, and it was in fact made out of a special unhardened iron, precisely as John prophesied it would be, but they also used that plate armament on their horses as well. It was known as barding. And when you covered the horse in plate armor, the horse took on the strange appearance of a locust. It literally looked similar to a locust physically. The text mentions another strange detail about this practice of barding, and the physical similarity in appearance to locusts it created on the horses. The plates on the horse were made in smaller movable flaps to give flexibility to the movement of the horse. When these smaller plates were overlapped on the horse, it created the appearance of a feather-like surface. It literally looked like the feathers you see on a bird's wing. So when you read in the text John describing the sound of their wings running into battle, it makes complete sense why John would describe these horses in the language he did. It is the same kind of visionary language anyone would have naturally used to describe these images. And to further illustrate that this is precisely what John was referring to, the literal meaning of the Greek word translated as wing actually means feathers. So John was literally saying the sound of their feathers sounded like many horses running into battle. Of course it did, because that is precisely what it was. And that is precisely what John was saying he was describing. Horses running into battle. Horses that looked like locusts, and looked like they had feathers. And that is about as good a description as anyone could have possibly given concerning the physical appearance of the Roman Byzantium army and its barded cavalry under the period of history we know today as the Papal Roman Empire. So you see, John's use of locust to describe this army had nothing to do with a bunch of literal locusts flying out of a bottomless pit, which is not even really in the text. The locusts have the faces of men, because that is what John is referring to, and they look like horses prepared for battle, because that is what they were. Just like the Assyrian army was described in the locust prophecy found in the book of Nahum. And he compares them to locusts because that is the kind of devastation this army would bring upon the land, and that is what they and their horses literally physically resembled. Together with John's astronomical dating, and his use of the term abyss, meaning the Roman place of the dead, used in verse 1, but translated bottomless pit. The era and object of these prophecies become unmistakable references to real history.
But these are not only swarming, destructive locusts, but they have scorpions too.
And if you look, this thing actually has a stinger. Right here. This is a stinger.
You don't want to get stung by one, and I never did, I'm glad to say. But if you do, they say it's really terrible.
But they're going to attack like scorpions. How many here have ever been stung by a scorpion?
have scorpion's tails.
How many here have ever been stung by a scorpion?
You have already seen in the previous section that when John uses the word locust, he is not referring to literal locusts, but to a human military entity. The same reasons he was not discussing literal locusts in Revelation chapter 9 are applicable to his use of the term scorpions as well, because the two terms are used alternately throughout the 12 verses of the first part of the chapter. So we have already seen what John was referring to in his use of the term locusts, but there is even more to this story when we come to his use of the term scorpions to describe this army. Because it will introduce an entire chapter in history that factually documents the historical attempt to hide what John was referring to in his use of the term scorpion. Throughout chapter 9 verses 1 through 12, John will alternate between two symbolic references to describe the army which arises under the authority of the Antichrist to power. In verse 1, the first symbol is the symbol of locusts, which we have just examined. And as you can see, John clearly identifies his language as symbolic, and points that symbolism at a human military order. The second symbolic reference he uses, interspersed within these very same texts, is the symbolism of scorpions. When we begin to examine this topic, something rather profound begins to emerge from history. You find another very important piece of historical evidence that demonstrates the Vatican recognized itself in the prophecies of the Book of Revelation, and manipulated the use of language to intentionally suppress the public's awareness of that very identification. If you were to ask any person off the street what this weapon is called, most nominally educated, average intelligent people would be able to quickly answer that it is a crossbow. There would not be much confusion or hesitation over that answer for most people. Some might call it a bow and arrow, but most would respond by quickly and easily identifying it as a crossbow. The dictionary will explain that the name crossbow is a conjunction of two words, the term cross, as in cross of Christ, and the term bow, as in bow and arrow. The term sounds very, very Christian, precisely as it was intended to sound. Debate will occur over exactly how and why the word cross was introduced, but in the end, it is actually not really known, nor relevant. The point is, whatever you wish to argue, the logic actually was, which has not been recorded historically, the original name of the weapon was clearly dropped and changed to this term. In fact, there are not too many weapons in the ancient Roman world that got the honor of bearing such a distinctively Christian name. Catapults remain catapults. Swords remain swords. Spears remain spears. Shields remain shields. Helmets remain helmets. But this one weapon got its very own brand new Christian name. The Cross of Christ, bow. The crossbow. The singular military weapon, dedicated to killing people by piercing, cracking and exploding their skulls and chests with metal, for Christ. How incredibly ironic. This weapon has been called the crossbow for centuries. In fact, if you actually look up the term crossbow and trace its etymology in history, you will discover it's been called a crossbow since the middle of the 1400s. That would make you think then that the crossbow was probably invented around the middle of the 1400s in Christianized Europe, and thus the very, very Christian name naturally given to it, because of all the wonderful Christian soldiers who wanted to be reminded of all the Christian things they were doing, and the very Christ who, rather than raise his hand to violence, was willing to die on the cross for their sins. After all, when you invent a new weapon, you give it a name. But if you thought that about the crossbow, you would be very, very mistaken. The crossbow has been around since actually before the time of Christ. Crossbows had actually existed when Christ walked on the earth. And crossbows existed when John wrote his prophecies in the book of Revelation in chapter 9. But there was a very big difference concerning the crossbow in John's time. It wasn't called the crossbow. Although the smaller handheld versions existed in John's time, this weapon had a larger version, which was usually mounted or carried in a wagon. And it was the most feared weapon by all of Rome's enemies in the entire ancient empire. But this weapon wasn't called a crossbow. After the cross of Christ, it had a typical military name which reflected the nature of what it actually did, how it looked, and what Rome's enemies compared it to, in military parlance. So why would Rome rename this famous, magnificent, and highly effective military weapon, responsible for so many victories in the history of the Roman Empire, all the way later, in the middle of the 1400s? Why would you do that? When the history of this magnificent Roman weapon was so established, well known, and appreciated both by the military which used it, and the people of the Roman Empire it served. When you start digging into that question, you will discover something very, very embarrassing to Vatican Rome, and not incidentally, this embarrassment occurred in the middle of the 1400s, precisely when the new name for this weapon emerged. To understand why Rome renamed this weapon, you have to remember what was happening in history to Rome in the middle of the 1400s. And there was something happening in the middle of the 1400s that was directly connected to the rather odd complete renaming of this highly effective historic military weapon in the Roman arsenal of tools for killing and maiming, and directly connected to having that very unique distinction among all the other weapons that never got renamed at all. Amazingly, if you look at a timeline of history, at important events in the mid-1400s, you are going to find that one of the most important events of Western civilization occurred in 1455. Right exactly in the middle of the 1400s. Amazingly, right around the documented earliest, first uses of the term crossbow to refer to this weapon. A first use of a renaming of this weapon, after it has already been around for over 1,000 years, and was credited with providing key victories in hundreds, perhaps even thousands, of battles throughout Roman history. So what was it? What could possibly be so embarrassing to Rome, that the very name, and even military history, of an established weapon over 1,000 years old, should be completely smothered, renamed and rewritten, for the public, of Christianized Europe? The thing that embarrassed Rome to such lengths, such reaction, and such effort, to literally want to smother a 1,000-year history was the publishing of the first printed Bible in the history of the world. And it was known as the Gutenberg Bible. Suddenly, mass production of copies of the full printed Bible became available to the public for the first time in the recorded history of the planet. And this event was an historic watershed moment for the Roman Empire. A moment of crisis public relations. But why did the publishing of the first printed Bibles provoke Rome to rename its most famous military weapon to the new name crossbow? Because along with the public being able to read the Bible in print, for the first time in recorded history, came their reading of Revelation chapter 9. And there was something in Revelation chapter 9 that was deeply embarrassing to Rome, in direct reference to this one unique weapon. It was an embarrassment they fully recognized was there, and attempted to address that embarrassment by changing the use of language surrounding it. And not only by changing the very language of what it was called, but also by initiating a full-blown PR campaign about Revelation chapter 9 and its reference to this very well-known weapon. Obviously, such actions were not necessary to begin with, if there was nothing there. But there was something there, and Rome knew there was a problem. Thus the actions in history to solve this problem. Not only did Rome rename its weapon with a new, very Christian-sounding name, it began teaching a new theology about Revelation, and even painting pictures in its cathedrals to make sure even their illiterate European audiences would get the message. So not only do you find a change in language documented around the very same time, you have the publication of the printed Bible, you have some new artwork showing up in Rome's cathedrals in Europe. And this is what that new artwork looked like, and not surprisingly, it was all about this embarrassing problem people could now read in Revelation chapter 9. The artwork appears at the same time that name change takes place, and at the same time the Gutenberg Bible is printed and published. And all of these events in history were directly connected to one another. So what was the problem? What was in this new printed Bible that the public could now read for themselves for the first time in history, that was so completely embarrassing and threatening to Rome, that Rome invented a brand new name for one of the most effective and famous military weapons in its entire history? What was it that prompted its priests and patrons to finance new artwork on the walls of its cathedrals? What was it that quickly motivated both Roman king and pope alike to literally invent and implement a brand new Christian name for one of its most ancient and renowned military weapons? The answer to that question becomes apparent when you discover two facts. The first of these two facts is when you discover what is in the text in Revelation chapter 9 that they were trying to hide. And the second fact is when you discover what the former name of these crossbows actually used to be. When you learn the truth about these two facts and see them together at the same time, then you will realize why everyone today, 6 centuries later, thinks this weapon is called the crossbow and not what it actually is, and what it was openly called for over 1,000 years in history, even back to the time of the Apostle John. What you see when you look up the etymology of the term crossbow and find out it was coined in the middle of the 1400s, and then you check the middle 1400s and discover that was the same decade the Bible was published in print, then you see what the Vatican and later the Counter-Reformation was, and still is, hiding from the public, for 6 centuries now, behind that new name, the crossbow. Latin is the language of the Roman Empire. Even today, liturgical rites in the Roman Catholic Church are still conducted in Latin despite the fact only its priests are still knowledgeable of the Latin language, and its laity have no clue what the Latin mumbo-jumbo their priests are speaking even mean. Because of the fact that no one speaks it anymore in common usage, it is considered a dead language. Meaning that the definitions of words in the language no longer change. What is interesting about Latin is that if you go to Google Translate on your computer and type in the word crossbow, it will translate to the Latin word scorpionem. If you type in the word scorpion, it will also give you the Latin word scorpionem. Why it's that? Because there is no word crossbow in Latin. It is literally the same word as the word scorpion. And this is a fact that every Roman Catholic priest familiar with and able to read Latin already fully knows. So when you see the English word scorpion in your English text, the Latin reader is literally looking at the same word as crossbow. Since the words scorpion and crossbow are the same words in Latin. This name, however, was intentionally dropped in the English language and in English translations, intentionally bearing the memory of the significance of this Roman term in the book of Revelation. Because the term itself was a uniquely Roman reference to a very prominent Roman weapon, which still exists and is visible in Latin to this very day. You will also discover what all that new Vatican theology was attempting to bury, and all that cathedral art being commissioned to be painted on the cathedral walls was attempting to hide. And you will also discover what John was prophesying about in Revelation chapter 9, with all the symbolism about scorpions. You see, militaries have often named weapons after dangerous creatures. Even today, the practice of naming weapons after formidable or distinctive creatures in nature that displays some trait that is similar to what the weapon looks like or does, is still in use. Even today, we have helicopters we have named after birds. Fighter jets we have named after animals. Missiles we have named after insects and Native American relics. And often the names of these weapons are so well known to the public, and so famous for their roles in battles, in the context of our contemporary culture, no additional explanation is ever needed. We don't use the generic words, such as helicopter or jet airplane. Even in our newscasts, our TV news reporters refer to the name of the weapon itself. We hear statements all the time even today, which need no further explanation, such as, 2 Black Hawks went down today over Afghanistan. A Stinger was fired at a Taliban position, etc. The contemporary language of our day make these references immediately recognizable and understandable to any audience. And the same was true of John's reference to scorpions in Revelation chapter 9. Because the name of this weapon that Rome bent over backwards to delete from history and erase from the mind of the public. The name of this weapon that Rome literally commissioned paintings in their cathedrals to now hide from view. The name of the weapon that the Vatican began pushing an entire new theology in order to make disappear. The name of that weapon was the very same name. John in Revelation chapter 9 says he sees in his vision of the Antichrist and his army. The name of that weapon in Latin was Scorpio, which means scorpion. And the army that came upon the land as locusts were easily identifiable to John's audience, because they had the power of scorpions, which was a well-known weapon in John's own day called by that same name. A weapon we now call today the crossbow. And hide behind ridiculous pictures of hyper-literalistic zombie-producing locust scorpion men from a fictitious bottomless pit in the center of the earth that will never exist. all allegedly, from Revelation chapter 9. But literally intended to actually hide from view what John clearly actually literally wrote to the audience of his own day. John's use of the term scorpions, in reference to a vision about a military, needed no additional explanation to his audience. Just as it didn't, even as late as the middle 1400s, until Rome went on its history rewriting PR campaign to expunge these things from the consciousness of Europe's public. And that is why you have counter-Reformation preachers today, all over your TV sets, and radios, and magazines, and newspapers, talking about locusts and scorpions and bottomless pits and raptures, and calling these things crossbows instead of what they were actually known as in John's day. That is why we have preachers today talking about locusts and scorpions and calling these things crossbows, and still to this day, hiding all the inform on the open that puts Revelation chapter 9 in its original historical context. John makes it clear again to his audience who he is prophesying about, because he says this locust army of Revelation chapter 9 has the power of scorpions. Just as our army today has the power of blackhawks and warthogs. And that is what they are hiding about scorpions in Revelation chapter 9. The first part of the zombie hoax claim is based on Revelation chapter 9, verse 5, which reads as follows in the King James Version. Quote, "And to them it was given that they should not kill them, but that they should be tormented 5 months, and their torment was as the torment of a scorpion, when he strikes a man." End quote.
All this is a part of the plan of God. All this demonic plague that's coming on the earth is God's plan.
I'm gonna send a demonic army of locusts that sting like scorpions. While these scorpions are tormenting these people for 5 months, I guess it's so bad that they want to die, but God won't let them. I guess it's so bad that they want to die, but God won't let them. I guess it's so bad that they want to die, but God won't let them. I guess it's so bad that they want to die, but God won't let them. I guess it's so bad that they want to die, but God won't let them.
Oh, it's so bad. I want to die. Hey, what did you do that for?
As you have seen in the previous video, beginning with the substitution of the term abyss with the substitute term bottomless pit, and now in the previous section, suppression of the history of the Roman weapon known as the scorpion. The idea of demonic locust scorpion bugs from a bottomless pit are known hoaxes, to intentionally hide the historical contents of these texts from the public. Clear historical evidence of that fact can be seen in every element of counter-Reformation rapture theology on this section that we have looked at so far. And you are about to see more evidence of that intentional obstructionism. The last part of this particular counter-Reformation hoax is the claim that while these bugs from this bottomless pit are torturing people, they will not be able to die, so that God can torture them even more. As noted earlier, Revelation chapter 9 is a prophecy about the coming of 2 armies. The first army is described in verses 1 through 12 and the second army is described in verses 13 through 21. And both of these armies spell doom for the city of Antioch, the destruction of the city of Antioch being the whole point of the trumpet judgments, to begin with. The reference to the power of scorpions is a reference to the Roman military weapon, the scorpion. But John describes a series of opposites or contradictions in verses 1 through 11, in his description of the first army. He says in verse 1 that its leader is like a star from heaven, but that he is given a key from the abyss below. Then he states in verse 2, he sees smoke and fire which kill locusts, but in verse 3, out of the smoke and fire come locusts. Then he states in verse 4 they are not supposed to hurt any green things such as the trees or grass, but that they are locusts which naturally destroy precisely that. Then he states in verse 4 they are commanded not to hurt the people of God, but in verse 11 their king is actually the angel of Satan. He states in verse 8, they have the hair of women, but in verse 7 they have the faces of men. He states in verse 6 they will seek death, and in verse 6 death will flee from them. These are a constant series of opposites or contradictions all the way through his description, and one of those opposites and contradictions is that they are commanded not to kill, but they torture men as the sting of a scorpion for 5 months. That last opposite or contradiction is a contradiction the counter-Reformationists never see. In fact, they do not really see any of these opposites or contradictions because they actually try to make these contradictions disappear, destroying the entire point of this text. Those statements are supposed to be contradictions because John is pointing out the contradictory nature of this army, movement, order, government, institution, etc. He is pointing out their hypocrisy, with these series of opposites and contradictions. So, when the counter-reformationists gets to verse 5 and 6, he completely misses the point of the text, which has nothing to do with death being suspended on earth so that people can be tormented by scorpion stings for 5 months. It has to do with another opposite or contradiction. The reason counter-reformationists all miss this opposite or contradiction is because counter-reformation theology was invented in Europe in the Middle Ages in response to the Reformation and the printing of the Bible. And in Europe there is no contradiction with 5 months of torture and stings of a scorpion. The kind of scorpions they have in Europe present no such contradiction in the text. Scorpion stings in Europe are painful but they do not kill. In fact, in most of the world, scorpion stings are painful but do not kill. But there are many species of scorpions, and depending on which species John was referring to in his text, the meaning changes. For example, if you did that with different snake species, you would see how the meaning of the text would become different. Here is the statement choosing snakes as the reference, and watch how the meaning changes based on the species of snake. Let's read the first example. Their torment was as the torment of a garden snake, when it strikes a man. That doesn't sound too bad. But let's change the species to something a little more venomous. Their torment was as the torment of a cobra, when it strikes a man. Now the text is describing death. Cobra venom is deadly. Now you have a clear opposite or a contradiction. Living death for 5 months. The text would not be describing torment without death, it would be describing a long, slow, painful death, after stating they weren't supposed to kill. And that would be a contradiction. Now, if an author used a generic reference to snakes, the only way you would have of knowing what snake species he was referring to, would be to know what area of the world the author was writing in or to, and what kind of snakes lived in those areas he was making a reference to. As you have already seen, John is writing from the island of Patmos, which is off the western coast of modern-day Turkey, and he was born and raised in the Middle East. Now here is the amazing thing about scorpions in those areas. The species of scorpions that live in those areas are not the same kind of scorpions they have in most of the rest of the world, such as Europe, Asia or the Americas. The kind of scorpions they had in Asia Minor and in the Middle East are known by the species name of Androctonus, which is Latin for man-killer. They are also called fat-tail scorpions. And this was the scorpion species that the Roman military weapon was named after, that we just got finished looking at. It was a deadly scorpion. Even today, this species of scorpion is responsible for many deaths every year, even with the benefit of modern medicine and scorpion anti-venom. But in the ancient world, without modern medicine and anti-venom, this species of scorpion was deadly. And invoking its image was a metaphorical reference to something which would kill you. And this is the scorpion sting John is referring to in this text. And that is why he is referencing not torment without death for 5 months, but a contradiction or hypocrisy, that despite the fact they were commanded not to kill, they would torture people to death. Which is a very different meaning in this text, than what counter-reformation theology from the Middle Ages will paint, making reference to their European scorpions. The second part of the zombie hoax claim that death will be suspended just so God can torture people longer, comes from verse 6, which reads as follows, quote, "And in those days shall men seek death, and shall not find it, and shall desire to die, and death shall flee from them." End quote. Here, they interpret this text to mean that death is magically suspended, and no one is able to die on the earth. Like if someone flings themselves off a building to commit suicide, they will either supernaturally float on the air, or hit the ground and nothing will happen to them. If they slit their wrist, the cut will then magically disappear. If they swallow poison or acid, it will magically have no effect. Counter-Reformation theology depends, quite consistently, on belief in magic when it comes to the Book of Revelation. Every ridiculous interpretation they create in the theology is always completely justified because reality for counter-reformationists is based on medieval magic. There is no correlation for them between the absurdity of a claim, and whether or not it is justified or contradicted by what we know about reality from common sense, logic or science. It is based entirely on a medieval worldview, based entirely on magic. That was one of the major distinctives of Reformation theology. They applied the science of textual criticism to study the texts. They applied research into language and history and culture to discern its intended meanings. They appealed to individual conscience and reason to debate and teach the meaning of texts. But in the Counter-Reformation, the Church decided by way of an authoritarian decree what everyone would believe without any regard to whether or not any of it was actually really true, even in the slyest sense of the word. John was not predicting in verse 6 that death would be impossible or suspended, and it would magically become impossible for anyone on earth to die, no matter what they did. What John was saying in that text has been lost in translation, like many texts in Revelation we have already looked at. But what isn't seen in the English text is the nuance of meaning conveyed by these words to John's original audience. The word, translated seek, in verse 6 means exactly that. But it is a Hebraic expression used to mean worship or veneration. It is the same expression you read when you read commands that you are to seek God. Seek has a more complete meaning than just the word worship because it incorporates all the activities of your life, not just the act of worship, but the totality of one's life. So John is saying these men will seek death, like people are supposed to seek God. They have made death their God. The second part of the first sentence, however, is that they, quote, shall not find it, end quote. Here too there is another nuance of meaning that is missed. When you find something, you discover it, you see it, you find out about it. And that is the sense that the term find is being used in here. So in other words, the first sentence in verse 6 is literally saying these men will worship and venerate death, but they will not discover, perceive, or see it. John is saying they will be worshiping death and never find out. Then he says in the second sentence, they will desire death, and death will flee or run from them. In these two sentences we see another set of opposites or contradictions. They will worship death and never see it. They will desire death, yet death will run from them. Counter-Reformationists claim this is because people are so tormented by their scorpion locusts, they want to die, but they can't. But John is writing a riddle of contradictions or hypocrisy. They worship death and never realize it. They desire death, but even death doesn't want to have anything to do with them. This was clearly intended to be an insult. Most people have heard the joke that someone was so bad that not even hell wanted them. John is saying this about this army. They love death, they worship death, they venerate death, they want to die as martyrs, yet even death doesn't want to have anything to do with them, even death runs away from them. During the time that John wrote this text, suicide had never been criminalized. It was not viewed as a great thing, but in certain situations it was understandable. There was no particular lasting stigma associated with suicide, even among Jews. King Saul was not viewed in particularly positive terms and he committed suicide. So it wasn't associated with godliness. But that was pretty much the end of it. Among the pagans it was practiced in certain hopeless situations. Again, not particularly encouraged but certainly not stigmatized. However, under the new theocracy of the Roman Byzantium Empire which these texts are prophesying, and under this very military order John is prophesying all this hypocrisy about, despite the fact they venerated corpses, and spent days and weeks in catacombs and crypts fondling and praying to the dead, precisely as John describes them, they also simultaneously criminalized suicide. Obviously you cannot really punish someone who is dead, so what this regime did was punish the family of the deceased by confiscating all their wealth and property, and making them virtually penniless and homeless, and that is how we got the stigma associated with suicide today. John points out that contradiction is another trait of their hypocrisy. It had nothing to do with the magical suspension of all death on planet Earth, no matter what anyone did. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Literally. John points out the hypocrisy that while these men actually worship death and the very angel of death was their spiritual king, they also simultaneously criminalized it. If death was so great, why did they criminalize it? John turns the hypocrisy of that contradiction into an insult about them, stating that even the object of their worship and veneration, which was death, wanted nothing to do with them. And that is the point of verses 5 and 6. We will look at these texts in much more detail when we exegete the verses in this chapter, after we finish this section on glossary terms and clarifications for chapter 9. But for now, it is sufficient to note these texts do not suggest there is no death at all. In fact, John is stating there is going to be quite a bit of death, both venerated and created by this army, yet their attitudes and relationships to death, like everything else they will be doing, will be completely contradictory and hypocritical. Because their leader is in reality the Antichrist. Someone who claims to be following Christ, yet replaces him with the angel of Satan, which is the biggest hypocrisy and contradiction of all. And the very identity of that person in these events in history are precisely what the Counter-Reformation is actually defending and intentionally hiding from the Christian public, with all these ridiculous distortions based on a medieval worldview of magic, complete with bottomless pits and zombie-producing locust scorpion bugs from the center of the earth, in their explanations of Revelation chapter 9. In this video, you have seen that the claims that John is prophesying the coming of zombie-producing locust scorpion bugs, which emerged from a non-existent fictitious bottomless pit, were known cover stories when they were invented, for the actual contents of Revelation chapter 9, which the Counter-Reformation did not want the Christian public to know about. And you also saw from the original language text, that these distortions are not supported by the actual language used in the text. A fact, the originators of these cover stories were already aware of when these substitute explanations were being spread in Europe. This completes the first 3 topics of our glossary topical study on Revelation chapter 9. The bottomless pit hoax, the locust scorpion man myth, and the tortured zombie hoax. The next set of glossary terms and clarifications we will look at will be breastplates of iron. Are these really modern-day bulletproof vests as the Counter-Reformation claims? Apollyon as their king. Is that really some obscure unknown esoteric reference to some occult demon that will possess the Antichrist as the Counter-Reformation claims? And 4 demons in a river. Are there really 4 magical sorcerous demons that live in the river Euphrates that will be unleashed on the world in the end times, as the Counter-Reformation claims? After we cover those 3 questions, we will end this section on glossary terms and clarifications by exposing the claim that the fire referred to in this chapter is a reference to atomic warfare, and the claim there will be an army from the east of 200 million Chinese or Russian soldiers. You will be amazed at how much is being intentionally hidden from the public under these patently bogus claims from this chapter in the book of Revelation. You will also be amazed at what they have managed to hide. The truth about Revelation chapter 9 is actually much more amazing and astounding than even the most salacious versions of the Hollywood pulp fiction lies they used to bury it with. You will see why even their efforts to hide this chapter, which have taken billions of dollars and centuries of work, are still not enough to avoid the amazing message in Revelation chapter 9. A message God Himself has just recently brought attention to, from the whole world, in order to remember. You will be truly amazed at what you are about to learn. Make sure and watch the next video, where more age-old lies and cover stories from the Counter-Reformation are completely exposed. Thank you for watching.